Welcome everyone to the Regenerative Insights Circle. And today we have Joe Petroni and Carl Welty presenting on the concept of listen to your land. This is the kind of session that some of us dream about because the dynamic is just so nice. We've known each other through these meetings, and then Carl and Joe, both architects, have talked and converged, and I'm so curious to hear what they're thinking together. This is exactly how these things should be working. This is part of our purpose, I think, our common purpose. The Regenerative Insights Circle is meant to be an appreciative inquiry. We're here to listen, to build upon. If I haven't met you before, I'm Ed Crosby, and I look forward to meeting you. Today, we're just going to do an online check-in. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat putting down who you are, where you're from, what you're thinking, what brought you here, that would be nice. And then come on back for another one of our meetings where we'll have a much more open chat format, and we switch back and forth between these more focused sessions and open conversations. So that's enough introduction from me. And I will turn it over to Joe and Carl. The floor is yours. So happy you're here.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
I was thinking we could also do a brief introduction of ourselves before we head on to the presentation. So I am Joe. I am an architect working in the regenerative field and trying to figure out what regenerative architecture might be and what it might look like. And a lot of my questionings are around context and how do you bring out the potential of a place. And so it always starts with listening. So that's how we converged onto this topic with Carl.
Thank you, Joe. I'm Carl. I'm an architect in Southern California, and also like to believe that I'm an architect with committed to regenerative thinking or regenerative design. At the center of my work, energy efficient design comes from what we might call old school passive solar from the 1970s, when much of the stuff people think they're rediscovering now was done 40 years ago and sometimes done better. Other topic that drives me is modern art, and we'll discuss that as well in detail. But for me, modern art is an effort to break out of the mechanistic worldview of classical and Western culture. And thank you for being here.
Thank you all for being here. So listen to your land as a way to recalibrate the way we build for the regenerative age. The bold statement that we started from was we can do better than just less bad buildings. And I think this applies to other fields as well. We do in this presentation talk about architecture because this is the place that we start from, but we'd love to see how these lenses that we talk about and explored in these conversations together apply to other regenerative endeavors in general. Listening is always a good first step. And there are a couple of things that we need to sort of think about when listening. Context is one of the starting points of any project. Nature is the driving force and the inspiration of any project. And the complexity of nature, of course, is best understood using systems thinking and complexity tools rather than linear ones. Listening is very important, but we'd like to explore listening to what? There's a lot of layers that you can use to listen to a place. And we're going to go through some of them together. This is not an exhaustive list. It is a starting point for conversation. All of these layers that we're going to go through can be seen in the context of the different scales. This is a chart that is being used by the ETH Zurich Systems Design Lab, which has a wonderful course from sustainability to regeneration. And so you can listen to a place from the chemistry level all the way to the bioregion and then the ecoregion. All of these scales matter. And when you go through a place, you could be mindful of that. The starting point is how not to do it. The top-down approach, imposing the human will onto nature, seeing nature as a machine. That has been tried and it doesn't work. The second very natural layer of listening to a place for a project is what the law requires of you and what it lets you do. And we all know from the sustainability towards regeneration graph that we know and use, this barely one step above breaking the law place, where all the standard endeavors, plans, and projects happen. I am allowed to do this much. When you start to inquire a bit more on how to use a place better, you start understanding, as I have in my practice, that you can bring more efficiency to your building once you understand the way a site works. You can place your house better towards the sun, towards the winds, towards the elements, and that makes it more energy efficient. And here we have some examples, and I will let Carl take over.
Thanks, Joe. So this is an example of a well-placed house, but it's a drawing of a Socrates' house. At one level, this is a diagram that's very similar to what you see when you're looking at houses designed from the 1970s, passive solar. But the point is that these principles of orienting a house to the south or to the sun, the south if you're in the northern hemisphere, is the first step. Maybe the second step is to have a roof overhang that keeps the summer sun out to keep the house cooler in the summer. And thinking about the winds for cooling and keeping the winter winds out. So these ideas have been around forever. Quick note, this is one example of a series of projects that I've elected from the list of perhaps the best of the best energy efficient buildings. Out of 111 projects at the time on the Living Building Challenge website, 9 of them were better than 50% better than normal. 8 of those 9 incorporated the basic principles of passive solar, direct orientation, roof overhangs or architectural elements to keep the summer sun out, taking advantage of breezes for cooling. The one project that doesn't follow those rules is a building with no windows to do a seed library. So 100% of the buildings that are better than 50% better than normal all follow these simple principles.
Once you start to get a feel for listening to the elements of a site, you can zoom out a little bit more and discover the permaculture way of seeing a site. You can make sector maps, understand the wildlife corridors, the fire sectors of a site, where the hot wind blows in the summer and where the breezes, the icy winter winds come to you. And once you do that, you understand that the house is not the single most important thing on your site. All of that land is. And so you start to really get an appreciation for the site in the grander scheme. The ones who have been doing this forever, and arguably they're doing it much better than our analytical top-down approach, are the ones who have been building traditionally in a place. They have empirically, generation by generation, tried and tested and tweaked solutions that are specifically adapted to that particular place. They have listened to their land, the same land, generation after generation, and you cannot get better efficiency than that. Carl, if you want to say a word about explorations.
There's a few examples of vernacular climate-appropriate architecture from around the world. Wind catchers from India, wind cooling towers from ancient Persia. The oldest Persian wind cooling towers are 800 years old, but they've been building them for 3,000 years. But I want to just draw attention to the very American-looking thing from New Orleans. This is an example of vernacular architecture or climate-appropriate. The tall ceilings in an old house with the tall windows was the air conditioning system. So even this vernacular climate-appropriate architecture is built into cute Americana normal houses. Much to learn from indigenous wisdom with indigenous people. This is an extraordinary example. It's the Sun Dagger part of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, or across the world, indigenous people mark, whether it's a handprint or a point on a rock face, to indicate when the summer solstice. This is perhaps the most sophisticated one. It's 3 rocks leaned up against the mountain and a spiral cut into the rocks. This is, as archaeologists tell us, is the only example that tracks both the movement of the sun and the movement of the moon. So it's an extraordinary thing. It's called the Sun Dagger at Chaco Canyon. If people want to explore that more, it's an amazing example of the importance of tracking the seasons indigenous people had to, because they didn't have an air conditioning system to turn on.
Once you start to add these cultural elements of a place and its history into your listening, you start to get a feel for the culture of a place. This opens up a whole new dimension, especially when you try to bring a new element to the culture of a place. When you're making a project, you are changing, you are interjecting, you're communicating with the culture of that place. So understanding it is a very important step. And it also helps to get the community, the people who are there right now, on board. And of course, the Regenesis group has been doing this wonderful work and very hard work for a bunch of years now, bringing a place towards social cohesion, understanding what the incentives and the visions of the people who are around your place, your land. Genius Loci is the spirit of the place. Deep down, beneath the cultural layers, the social layers, the ecological layers, there is a undefined almost, and we're dealing now with a sort of different territory, different type of lens, the feel of a place. And we're going to delve into this. We're going to start with the sort of intuitive work that I did as my master's thesis when I was an architecture student, without fully knowing that I was going to discover permaculture, and from permaculture start my way into passive solar design, from that studying my way onto sustainability, discovering systems thinking, and then regenerative design. I was much too young for all of this. But I had a vague clue about how important understanding the feel of a place was. And I also had a knack for philosophy and jargon and fancy words. And so I made a whole thesis on phenomenology of space, which is the way a place makes you feel. This is very sort of niche discussions, but there are a select few of us who actually do believe that good architecture makes you a better person. Good architecture can make you feel a certain way, and it can make you connect with a place, with the spirits of that place, in a way that makes you become fuller, makes you experience life in a different way. All grand words, which were, as you can see, implemented in a vineyard project in the middle of nowhere, where I tried to take the culture, the spirit of that place, and make an interjection that would make sense to it.
So I have come to this place that Joe and I share, the ideas that Joe and I share from a different place regarding the energy part of it. I'm old enough to have gone to school in the late 70s, early 80s, so I was introduced to passive solar. But this other sense comes from my questioning of that Renaissance linear perspective is not real. It's a cultural biased system. This led me into discovering modern art and what I think is the essential element of modern art. Their goal was to create a language to better understand and analyze the natural world, or analyze a world outside of what our linear minds can think of. And particularly the Russian artist El Lissitzky whose work heavily influenced my thinking. His paintings are called Prowns. Just a couple of points from his writings. The Prown was a process towards architecture, very much a meditative and nonlinear way of thinking about architecture. He thought of it as a project for the affirmation of the new, which, just growing out of an intuitive process. And some ideas from Liszewski that I find really very powerful and a very important part of thinking about the canvas or a piece of paper is we have to free ourselves from the assumed perpendicular axis. The idea that we look at a piece of paper or we think about things from an assumed perpendicular axis is very much the basis of European linear perspective. And also the idea of canvas is infinite space. And he says, Prown has the power to create aim. So these are all, I think, really important ideas for us to consider when we're drawing is to think about these things, not as limitations, but to understand the cultural biases that we bring to even how we start to think about something. So from this inspiration, I started a process in college, discovered a process of this meditative design analysis and form making. So these are two examples from my graduate school thesis of how to think about a row house in San Francisco. What is a house between two walls? So I have come to the same point with Joe about a language to listen and understand a place in a deeper, more intuitive way. Another example, Kandinsky, who is notable for the first European artist to do abstract art. So there was no subject. But for Kandinsky, color and shapes, he reveals the potential for using these abstract colors and shapes as ways of thinking about something. And so Kandinsky was a person who had a sense called synesthesia. So when he heard sound, he sensed color and vice versa. So this idea that colors and shapes and patterns can be used as a thinking tool. Kandinsky represents that symbols as thinking tools. This is a Chinese painting from 960, which has an abstract quality. Chinese landscape painting, it's often described as vague or conceptual, but that's in relationship to Western perspective. Chinese landscape painting has always been about these ephemeral sort of understanding nature in a deeper or intuitive way. Again, another Chinese landscape painting that's wonderfully magical and abstract and meaningful. And then also a Monet painting, which is strikingly similar to the Chinese landscape painting. So Monet says, I'm following nature without being able to grasp her. I'm perhaps having become a painter to the flowers. So to me, this really embodies what we're talking about, finding tools to get us to think past what we think we already know.
We're going layers and layers and layers deeper. But there is an intuitive element to understanding a place that everyone has. Some, such as Ross Chapin, who's also an architect, you call it the beauty mind. This intuitive understanding, knowledge, a feel maybe of what beauty is, what fits in a place, what makes sense and what doesn't. Now, on top of all of these layers and so many others that we could add, there is a dimension to listening, the dimension of time, because a place isn't the place that you see in front of you from the scale of the cell, of the ant, of the leaf, of the tree, of the river, of the hill, of the ecoregion. But it is also all of these things in every slice of time, millions of years ago, up until its more recent history. And getting a feel or understanding for the geological history of a place, the cultural history of a place, brings such an enormous richness to a project. And again, we find inspiration in vernacular architecture because when we speak of time, we speak of understanding the rhythms of nature. And vernacular architecture is so in tune with the rhythms of nature. Here is an example from Indian architecture from the book Ritual House, which we highly recommend, of the daily migration in the summer from cooler daytime spaces to cooler nighttime spaces. There's sleeping on the roof where nighttime breezes keep you cool, but then in the day, sheltering in the lower, cooler parts of the house. And then the seasonal migrations, another scale of rhythm from the summer places to the winter places, places that are naturally warmer in the winter. Other architects have tried to do this. And when you do not listen fully to nature, you can go a bit overboard. And here's an example of an architect trying to shade everything everywhere all at once onto Carl's case study.
Thanks. I just want to one comment about that last picture. The architect's intent was to do something with the sun. It's a wonderful thing, but it's also so complex compared to Socrates' house from 3,000 years ago. It doesn't need to be so overworked. We can be simple about it. So a project that I'm very proud of is a water education campus in Southern California for the Chino Basin Water Conservation District, which is one of the very first government agencies who is tasked to both educate people about water conservation, but also to manage refilling a local aquifer. So the context of this site is in the shadows of a canyon, San Antonio Canyon, which is an enormously important feature in the landscape of this part of Southern California's East Los Angeles County. The canyon is San Antonio Canyon, and the mountain, San Antonio Mountain, which is also called Mount Baldy. It's visible from many miles away. The erosion from the canyon over geological time has shaped the geography of the area and also the hydrological cycle. So all the rubble and rocks from that canyon has created a large amount of rocks underground, which is the aquifer that this agency manages. The site of the campus is 6 miles due south of the canyon. Tasked to design a building about water, and knowing that the canyon is a significant part of the region's hydrological cycles and the geography. So for whatever reasons, cubism or something, I was inspired to go up into the canyon to meditate about how do you make a building that's about water. And so I went up into the canyon and thought about this. And the huge lesson is that when you open yourself up to nature, this is a lesson for me, when I open myself up to nature and ask this simple question, nature always provides really great inspiration for unusual architecture. I was inspired by the idea that to make the building entrance a canyon-like entrance. The picture of the canyon is from the site. The canyon is an enormously important part of the place, the geography, the ecological history of the place. Want to share a quick story about the funny downspout that's right next to the front door. First of all, architects never put downspouts next to the front door because water is to be ignored. But I wanted to exaggerate the importance of water. And I also wanted to bring attention to the building entrance as part of nature. So I designed this downspout to be sort of an abstract tree. And an important part of thinking about architecture in this way is you have to give up the idea that people are going to understand exactly what you mean. So a wonderful story that came during the construction is that a person who was walking in and out of the building entrance, planting plants in the back garden, it wasn't until this abstract tree downspout was installed where he connected this entrance of the building to nature. And then this abstract tree downspout made him realize that the building entrance was like a canyon. So I would have thought that people understand building as canyon, entrance is canyon, and then the tree cut would just accentuate that. But in this case, it was the abstract tree that got him to realize that the building entrance was a canyon. So that's just a really great story that it does work sometimes, but it never works how you think it's going to work, which is what we have to give up as architects, that people are going to understand it exactly how we intend. The examples of an architecture that unfolds in time. The picture is a window in the conference room of the building, which was deliberately positioned to frame the view of the mountain and the canyon. Again, reinforcing the sense of the sequence through the building, but also placing the building within ecological in time and place. The other is from the middle of the building. So there's windows in the tower that track the sun. So the light changes throughout the day and throughout the seasons. And to me, this is a really powerful way of connecting the building and the users to how time is tracked through the movement of of light in the sun. Next to the wind cooling towers is a very large scupper that in the winter, when it rains, water flows off from a very large roof into the garden. But this dramatic architectural element, the hope is that it makes people realize water, even when water is not flowing, because in California, water doesn't flow very often. And then the next image is the drainage swells that are now very much part of California architecture. But the goal was to integrate the drainage swells into the architecture and vice versa, so that the building was about water.
And so a lot of the listening to your land practice is about living systems, whereas a lot of the down-to-earth architectural projects are about this mechanistic hierarchical approach to building that we have. And so the question is, how do you bridge the gap between these two worlds? Now we turn the discussion on to you. What experience of listening to the land did you have in your projects? What senses do you bring to a project? What other types of projects do you use listening in? And how do we communicate this need to slow down and to listen to regenerative projects as we move forward? Thank you. And on to you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody. Comments, questions, thoughts?
Thanks for your presentation. You went through a lot of ways that we can tune into a place and try to find out what it is that place wants and needs. And I really appreciate that. Maybe I could have you try to address is, I think there are ways to directly communicate with the land. You refer to a lot of observation and things like that, actually getting messages from the land. It sounded like, Carl, maybe you received some imagery relative to canyon shape. And I just curious if you've had those kinds of experiences that you've actually felt like the land communicated directly to you. And if so, then what form did it come? How does that work for you? Tuning in, we're trying to listen, not just observe what's going on, but get in our heart space and really listen to what the land has to tell us. And I'm curious about any experiences you may have had that are maybe more direct. To give you a little background, my partner recently published a book called Communicating with Plants. And so she actually directly communicates with plants on a regular basis. She actually communicates with land directly on a regular basis. So I'd love to hear any experiences you may have along those lines.
The experience that I had with this water education building going up into the canyon was, for me, a really direct experience. The traditional approach to architecture is imposing a geometry or an abstract idea onto a project or into landscape and ignoring the sun and everything else. But for me, the act of going up into the canyon and just being open, for me, it's a repeatable lesson. And it would always want to do that. Architects think you wouldn't ask the land what it wants to be because we just don't do that. But for me, the lesson is it doesn't limit your inspiration or your creativity. It just rushes at you. And so it's very much a direct experience. And I think it's an important lesson.
And it fits in your story with the category that we had about meditative sketching, intuitive understanding, but also, of course, with the indigenous wisdom, tapping into the way indigenous cultures communicate with the land and ask it what it wants. Okay, a lot of raised hands. Rick?
I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit more on the layers of listening. I caught some of it, but I just want to share some reflections before I hear from you or anybody else. One is, there's outside in listening, there's inside out listening, and then there's a state of being of the listener. And it's a question of how can you attune yourself in a way that you can actually do effective outside in listening, because without effective inside out listening, it's not going to work very well. And indigenous wisdom has so much to offer. I'm just interested in anybody's reflections. I love the idea of layers of listening. I mean, it's just, how do you listen in different ways that allows things to emerge that wouldn't if you didn't get into a state of being, as far as you can, connected to your higher self. And that's my reflections and wherever the conversation goes.
Daniel?
Yeah, I was caught in this conversation for the first, I was 13, 14, into the genius locking thing. And that was the main reason why we went to philosophy. I was trying to understand what was happening. And I realized that there's nothing there. We can point out, there's no out. It can be pointed to. There's nothing outside or inside. There's no boundary between and out or inward, outward, whatever. These artificial boundaries is something that allows us to listen because we believe there's something outside to listen. We believe there's factors like other beings or nature. So just mentioning that, I'm very pleased that you brought the concept of genius lucky here. It's very important. It's a keystone concept in this whole thing of belonging. It's a 10 hours conversation.
It's a key thing in regeneration as well, because what you're regenerating at the end of it is the spirit of the place. It's the place that you're regenerating. So tuning into that spirit is crucial. And sort of to Rick's point about layers, you know, how the earth is a disc and it sits on 4 elephants and the elephants sit on a turtle. And what's underneath the turtle? Well, the turtle sits on another turtle. And what does that turtle sit on? Well, it sits on another turtle. Like, okay. You know what? There's turtles all the way down. And I feel that's sort of the thing with the layers as well. You can go as esoteric as you want. It's like turtles all the way down. And the turtles go inwards and outwards as well.
Thanks. It's a great presentation, great conversation. Appreciate it. Yeah, I agree with Danielle. It's a 10-hour conversation. But I wanted to add something that I've found valuable when I'm designing is going back and looking at historical documents. Because even though I'm glad you brought up Regenesis group, like talking to people is very important, but so much has been fractured where I live. We do still have the colonial culture. The Spaniards, when they came, they made maps. And some of those old maps have information in them that you can still see where there was an old wetland that you wouldn't know otherwise, or where something that was part of the landscape that there might still be a remnant there, or something to tell you about that will help you to see more clearly what changes have happened, because now it's all built up and there's buildings everywhere and freeways and roads, and so much gets lost. Or old photographs is another one, if you can find old photographs. But obviously, even just asking somebody who's lived there a long time, they might tell you, oh, this always floods every year or something like that. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. So there is still a river here. So, to some of the points that were made earlier, that kind of information does not trump the importance of like the deep listening that was being talked about. So I'm really appreciative of this conversation in that way. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, I've got a couple quick points to the maps from a project that I have worked on that has the potential to be an enormously important ecological and cultural project if politics get out of the way. And it's a property on the coast. And we had a great opportunity to listen to the Native American spiritual leader. And we looked at maps, and it's also, those maps told us what was flooded. And the Native Americans told the Spanish when they first arrived, don't build your mission there because it will flood. And they built it there anyways, and it flooded. When I rethink of these lessons learned from Lissitzky, this idea of thinking about the canvas as an architect, that's what we work on. But the idea that the canvas is infinite space and free ourselves from the perpendicular axis. This is such a powerful idea of freeing ourselves from the way we think in Western culture. We limit ourselves from thinking about larger ideas, larger systems. So I just always appreciate these lessons from this brilliant artist from 100 years ago.
Well, I start sketching a plan. I still go for perpendicular lines. I'm still stuck there.
It's an enormous concept that blew my mind when I was a college student. The first time I did these meditative painting things was my last part of what we call fourth year design. And it was this huge epiphany where I did free myself from these assumptions. And what came out of it was a clarity of these mirrored issues that an architect has to solve, the site and all these parts. But as you work through these questions or these ideas, this analysis through symbols, it allows you to see the relationships between ideas subtle relationships you can't get to if you're just using a linear sort of perspectival thinking.
Thank you. So picking up from what Payon said, just popped into my mind. If any of you have seen Neil Spackman's film about Albeida, and there's one of these people who lived there long ago, and he looks out, look at desert, and he says, this used to be all forested. It was all forested. It's so jarring because the picture that you have in front of you is just really desert. So thank you for the layers. I think that's a great metaphor for approaching all sorts of things, not just architecture, but how do we approach our work? And Rick said, how can you attune yourself, whether you're in or out, regardless of what place you're in life? How you attune yourself is fundamental, and it relates to those layers in kind of a cool way. So thank you for bringing us to that.
Well, I must say that we didn't know if we would choose layers or lenses at some point. There was a discussion about that, and it did settle for layers. But there's also a fair point to be made towards the use of lenses. So just to keep that in mind. Catherine.
I just wanted to share a Regenesis story that they told me about a decade ago. They were working in the Baja, and their client wanted to put in a hotel on the bay. And the bay was dead. There was no life in it anymore. And so by listening to the land, they were able to see how the water flow had been interrupted by what had been done there, and to put the water flow back and place the hotel in a position where it sheltered and protected that water flow. And the result was that in a few years, the bay came back to life. So there was fish and all that there. So the listening to the land can have profound impacts way beyond just the building. You can actually heal if you build correctly.
That's, I think, the greater purpose of regenerative architecture. And we might get there in our lifetime, if we hurry.
Maybe yours.
Do we need to hurry, or do we need to slow down and listen?
Yeah.
I mean,
And use what we have. Ed Lancaster and his work in Tucson, using the streets that are already there and treating them as though they were artificial arroyos, so that you can take what's already there and then bring it back to life as well.
Yeah, especially now that a lot of the built environment is already built, and there's so much already built space that needs readapting to be used, instead of every other architect building something new and then demolishing the one next to it in this endless cycle. But that is yet another conversation of, do you build for 20 years or do you build for 200?
Both. I mean, if I could share one more story about this water building. I gave a presentation on passive solar design to a local group, and there was a woman who trained in India as an architect, and I was happy that she didn't know that I designed that building, and she really loved the building, which is always good. But what's most important is that she understood why I designed the way I designed, and she understood how the building, what she said was she really loved the way the building connects to nature. To me, it's evidence that when one transcends the Western way of thinking and connects in this meditative or sort of deeper way of connecting to nature, is that somebody who from India particularly, but from another culture, understood that because it was so far outside the way we think about buildings in the West. There's a really great example that there is something universal about it, but it's a lesson that in the West, the way we design building does not connect to nature. Anyway, that's just a lovely story for me that there is something universal about it.
Yeah. And also there's a fair point to be made about, like, we stated the layers, but then we didn't talk about the benefits. And the benefits are also layers. And one of the very important layers that I find is that the end result, which is a place, not necessarily built, but it's a new place, one that if it understands the rhythms of nature and it understands the spirit of that place, then the people who are using that space, the inhabitants of that space, are therefore them more connected to nature. And if people are more connected to nature, we did it. that's our aim.
I live in the hope that if we know more about nature, then we'll take care of it better.
Absolutely.
So that's
Biophilia will save the world. Biophilia 2.0, as in understanding nature, not as in putting ficuses in lobbies and green walls. Rick?
Just quickly play off your different metaphors of layers and lenses, and I think they have upsides and downsides. I said this before, but the lens metaphors can be telescopes, microscopes, and mirrors. And while you can tune out to nature, if you don't have a mirror to know your state of being and whether it tunes you to nature or not, it's very difficult. So I think there are pros and cons of different metaphors and playing around with them. And I'm sure other people have other metaphors by which they live. But sometimes people get too attached to a particular metaphor and it closes down the opportunities of looking at the benefits of other metaphors. So I just wanted to add that to the listening aspect of this. I mean, Aristotle originally said something like, if you listen carefully, you can detect people's metaphors. Daniel put his hand up, so I'm sure he could resonate with that. But anyway, he may have a different opinion or a different lens or a different metaphor, which is fine.
Well,
Right,
thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.